An American living in Russia started noticing dirty looks in the hallway at work. Not because of anything she said, because of what her face did. She smiled, and a coworker eventually pulled her aside to explain that, to Russian eyes, it looked like she was smiling at nothing, and it was creeping people out. That story comes from a much bigger conversation, started by a Chinese exchange student who just spent 2 months in the United States. She noticed something on the city buses that she couldn't stop thinking about. Total strangers talking to each other like old friends without ever formally introducing themselves first. Her actual question was sharper than, why are Americans friendly? She wanted to know if this was specifically American or just a broader Western thing. Because she'd grown up hearing the stereotype that Western people are outgoing and East Asians are reserved, and she wasn't sure where the line actually sat. The short answer that came back, again and again, it's a known, deliberate American habit. Not universal, not every single person, but common enough that nobody blinks when it happens. And the stories people told to prove it ranged from charming to borderline unbelievable. One American described walking up to a group of strangers in a British pub and announcing out loud that they were clearly having the most interesting conversation in the place. Could she join? The group blinked, said, "Well, that's very American," and let her in anyway. She ended up going to a scavenger hunt with them, making several new friends, and eventually dating one of the guys in the group. Someone else described picking up a random hitchhiker at a gas station during a 10-hour work drive, discovering he was a pilot school student starving for a break from studying, and ending up sharing a meal and a long conversation about aviation with a total stranger before driving off into the night. This is the part that gets me every time. None of these people planned any of it. The entire habit runs on a kind of default assumption that a stranger is probably fine to talk to until proven otherwise, rather than the other way around. But here's the twist that makes this more than a friendly people story, because plenty of the Americans admitting to this are self-described introverts. Multiple commenters described forcing themselves to do this specifically to fight social anxiety, not because it came naturally. One person said their whole strategy is pretending on purpose that everyone around them is happy and wants to talk, unless there's clear evidence otherwise, purely so they don't talk themselves out of it before it starts. And it's taught, not just willed into existence. One person credited it entirely to their father, who noticed his kid was more introverted and deliberately trained the habit into him. The same way you'd teach a kid to swim or ride a bike. There's a genuinely sweet, slightly ridiculous family story buried in here too. A grandmother, famous in her family for chatting up total strangers, once struck up a conversation with a random fisherman at a dock while her son secretly filmed her granddaughter mocking the whole exchange. When they checked later, the questions she'd actually asked were almost word for word what her granddaughter had guessed. What kind of fish have you got there? And so on. It became a running family joke that gets repeated anytime someone wanders off mid-outing to talk to a stranger. Now, here's where this stops being just charming and starts revealing something genuinely useful. Because sometimes this habit isn't about killing time. It's about noticing someone who actually needs it. One person described a stranger at a grocery store who looked lost, got offered help, and ended up opening up about a fresh cancer diagnosis he hadn't told his wife yet, because she was already dealing with early-stage dementia, and he didn't know how to add to it. They talked for about 10 minutes. He looked visibly better afterward. The person telling the story put it simply, sometimes you just need to talk to someone, and being that person for a stranger is worth more than the small talk it looks like from the outside. There's an unwritten topic list, though, and Americans are surprisingly consistent about it. Sports, weather, and light observational comments are safe territory. Politics and religion are treated as close to off-limits with someone you've just met. One person from Arizona put it bluntly. If a total stranger brings up either of those unprompted, they're probably trying to recruit you into something, not make friendly conversation. And this is where the Russia story from the top of the video actually connects to something much bigger, because friendliness doesn't translate the same way everywhere, and getting it wrong can genuinely backfire. The full version of that story: an American living and working in Russia kept smiling and waving at coworkers passing in the hallway. The exact reflex baked into American office culture. A local coworker eventually explained that repeated smiling and greeting someone you'd already greeted once that day read as strange, even insincere, smiling at nothing, in his words. She adjusted, said one polite hello in the morning and a simple goodnight in the evening, and the same security guard who used to scowl at her started smiling and waving back by the end of her stay. It's a small adjustment, but it reframes the entire American habit. It's not that Americans are simply nicer, it's that American culture treats repeated, low-stakes friendliness towards strangers as a kind of social lubricant, something you're supposed to keep doing, not something you did once and can now stop. There's a geography to this, too. And New Yorkers, of all people, ended up defending themselves the hardest in this conversation. Multiple lifelong New Yorkers pushed back on the cold city stereotype directly, explaining what's actually happening on a crowded subway car. An unspoken agreement to give everyone a bubble of privacy during a stressful commute, not real unfriendliness. One person's mother-in-law, visiting from a smaller city, found it sad that nobody was talking or making eye contact on the train, until it was explained that ignoring each other during rush hour is actually a form of politeness, not coldness. The same unspoken rule reportedly extends to spotting celebrities on the street. New Yorkers pretend not to notice on purpose, specifically to let them have a moment of normal life, and only talk about it with friends afterward. Drop the same New Yorkers into a bar, a dentist waiting room, or a fishing dock, though, and the switch flips instantly. One person described a Chicago bar tradition where strangers cycle through small talk about the weather and the lake's surface temperature for a solid half hour before finally getting around to the actual ball game, and then the goodbye alone can take another 45 minutes. So if you zoom out far enough, there's actually a rough map of this whole thing, and it comes from someone who's lived and traveled across several countries. The theory that kept coming up: you can roughly rank cultures on a scale of introversion to extroversion when it comes to strangers. British people lean toward reserved, Canadians and Kiwis sit a little further along, South Africans and Indians land somewhere in the middle, Americans, Irish, and Australians cluster at the extroverted end, with Americans, by most accounts in the thread, sitting right at the top of that list. And once you see it laid out that way, both halves of this video suddenly make sense at the same time. The Chinese student on the bus wasn't imagining things. Americans really do default to talking first. And the American in Russia wasn't being fake. She'd just been raised inside a culture where constant low-stakes friendliness towards strangers is the assumed baseline, not the exception you have to earn. It's the same instinct running through every story in this video: the pub in England, the hitchhiker at the gas station, the grandmother at the dock, the stranger in the grocery store, the subway car pretending not to notice a celebrity. Different situations, same underlying rule. Talk first and figure out if it was a good idea afterward. If a single smile can cause a diplomatic incident in a Russian office hallway, wait until you see what happens when Americans try to explain why a 4-hour drive doesn't count as far. That one's coming up next. Tell me in the comments, is striking up a conversation with a total stranger normal where you're from, or is it a little suspicious?